Hello, everyone, and welcome to another wonderful Wednesday webinar. I've been to the Swindon Community Hub today. Absolutely amazing 2-year birthday. They estimate they've had 200,000 people through over the last 2 years, and such a diversity of community. And so I had to repeat this from earlier, but my favourite quote of the evening was their oldest volunteer, Sue, who said, "When I moved to Swindon, I knew no one, and now when I've come to Swindon Community Hub, I know everyone." Absolutely amazing, the community work's going on through all of these centres across the UK now. So we have another wonderful Wednesday webinar tonight with Jack from Degrowth London. We met some of the Degrowth crew at the Green Gathering this year, fantastic festival. So without too much further ado, we'll come over to Jack. Thank you very much for coming and sharing. Tell us all about Degrowth. We want to know how we change things. Over.
Thanks. And yeah, it was Green Gathering was wicked. It was really nice. Sorry, I think Linda, your mic is on.
I'm just muting a few people. Carry on.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me, guys. I'm just going to quickly share my screen. And sorry if I'm kind of looking at various places. I'm still bad at PowerPoints, so I got like my notes on my phone, PowerPoint here. So bear with me. Okay, should be able to see the PowerPoint now. Yeah.
Yep, all good.
Great. Okay, cool. So so we were invited tonight to do a little talk about degrowth and the work of Degrowth London. So first kind of 20-25 minutes, I'm just going to talk about degrowth, what it is, kind of what the project is, and then I'm going to do a little bit of discussion around the work that Degrowth London does, and then hopefully have a little bit of time for some questions at the end. So our kind of website and email and our Twitter and Instagram are down the bottom there. But just quickly, so as I said, my name's Jack. I have been with Degrowth London since the start. We started in October 2022 with about 12 of us initially. We had our launch event in May this year. But myself, I'm just come out of masters at SOAS, but I also did a masters at UAB, which is the Autonomous Uni of Barcelona, in degrowth, economy, ecology, economics, and policy. And yeah, I'm environmental activist, also housing justice activist based in London. But enough about that. I'm going to talk about degrowth.
Jack, do you want to maximize your screen just or put the share slide presentation so we don't see all the other bits, if you can find that?
I probably don't know how to do that, to be honest. Let's have a go. Hold on.
If not, don't worry too much.
Yeah, it might be
share slideshow or anything.
You share.
Don't worry, it's not a biggie. Carry on. Just
I think I might have nailed it.
You can see a few.
Sorry, I would just use the PowerPoint app, but my PowerPoint isn't working.
Carry on, you're doing fine. No worries.
It's old. So yeah, sorry about that. Just ignore all my very disorganized tabs at the top. So how to click. There we go. So I'm going to start with a quick definition of degrowth for us to kind of keep in mind as I kind of go into the presentation more broadly. So the kind of base idea around degrowth is that infinite economic growth is impossible on a finite planet, and it no longer really serves us as an ideal. So the cut and dry definition of degrowth for us to kind of keep in mind as I'm moving through this presentation is it's a planned, democratic, and just downscaling of production and consumption in high throughput areas of the world, in line with planetary boundaries, and a reorientation of societal objectives towards care, well-being, autonomy, and ecological integrity. Maybe to note there, when I'm talking about high throughput areas of the world, I'm talking mostly about the global north, but particularly also areas like some countries in the Gulf, like maybe Qatar, Saudi Arabia would undoubtedly come into this category. But we'll go into a little bit more detail about kind of the areas of the world which might require degrowth in a little bit. But no, there we go. Okay, so some of these graphs you might have seen before, some of you might not. These are just kind of the one on the left really is just a To ground this in what we're talking about, I'm sure you're all aware there's a climate crisis going on, and this is the most recent research out of the Stockholm Resilience Centre, which tried to quantify the planetary boundaries that are being transgressed. So in over their existence in the last few years, they've been slowly trying to kind of gather data around which planetary boundaries are being transgressed. And in 2023, they managed to measure all of them, and we're transgressing 6 out of 9 of them, including CO2, including novel entities, including biosphere integrity, land system change, all these things. But this on the left is just to tell you what you already know, that there's a climate crisis going on, and it goes beyond CO2. It's about a more kind of biophysical crisis that we're undergoing. But hopefully you can see this on, but the kind of graph on the right here, I'm not sure, I'll just move that a second. Yeah. So the graph on the top right here is what I really like to focus on for a second and carry with us through this presentation, which is that when we're thinking about GDP growth, it is pretty much always tied to what's called material footprint. Material footprint basically is the amount of stuff that is used in an economy. So if you can see on the far right, there is a symbolization of GDP growth between 1990 and 2013, and it pretty much exactly tracks the amount of materials that flows through an economy. And yeah, and maybe also something to keep in mind is on the bottom right, there is some graphs about, so it's measuring GDP against what's called the global progress indicator, which is an indicator of well-being, which tries to include other things except economic activity, such as life expectancy, education. And this kind of shows that GDP doesn't necessarily track other metrics of well-being. So there's just a little bit of food for thought. But I wanted to, before we talk about degrowth, I wanted to kind of demystify growth a little bit, because economic growth is this idea, this concept that like really dominates political discourse at the moment. It's kind of the main policy objective of both big political parties in the UK and across the world. It's kind of seen as this objective, which basically really needs to. So I was just looking at the chat really quick. It's seen as this kind of cure-all. It completely dominates the way we think about economic policy. If we look at the paper, and if the reports are saying that GDP is up, that means society is doing well. But what I want to kind of explain here is that growth is a very historically specific kind of idea, and it's only really been about for the last 60 years. But I want to kind of go back and situate economic growth as an idea within the kind of story of capitalism, really. So these kind of next few slides are based off the work of Jason Hickel, who was one of my professors, but was also kind of a bit of a superstar in the degrowth movement. He wrote the book Less is More around the kind of peak of the Extinction Rebellion protests. And yeah, so he asked the big question, which is what explains the massive growth disparity between North and South? So I'm talking about global North, talking about Europe, North America, Japan and Oceania, and then the global South, areas of the world we typically consider as underdeveloped. And the kind of typical story is there are certain endogenous conditions of the West that meant it developed faster. So this is stuff like technological innovation, certain philosophies, geography, which meant that the West just happened to develop faster by virtue of its better means. And the typical discourse is that poor countries are just behind. And if given enough time and good market policies, they will advance through the stages of growth and catch up to the rich countries. This is what's known as catch-up development. But the argument here is that this is kind of an ahistorical and apolitical narrative that doesn't really assume any connection between the North and the South historically. Okay, so when we're thinking about how growth developed, particularly under the relations of capitalism, we can start with relations of production during feudalism and serfdom. So very quickly, like serfdom was these kind of set of social relations where you had serfs working on the land, you had them working for a lord, but you also had the commons, which were these areas of land which the serfs had some sense of autonomy over. Those were common areas of land where people were able to graze their livestock, but also grow food. And as a result of an elite backlash that emerged from a series of revolts, peasant revolts, around between the 1300s and 1600s. We had the famous Enclosure Act, which, hold on, let me just change a couple of slides. Yeah, so the Enclosure Act is basically this set of legislation that tried to centralize the control of land in order to increase productivity and output. And in the bottom left here, there's kind of a very small diagram about what land used to look like before the Enclosure Act and what land looked like after the Enclosure Act. So basically centralized control of land. And this basically led to a mass dispossession of the peasants, which created this exploitable labor force and a mass of consumers for new industrial goods. And so given this backdrop, I want to ask, what is unique about capitalist growth? And the kind of definition we can think about when we're thinking about capitalist growth is it seeks to increase production, not to meet human needs, rather to extract and appropriate surplus value. So when we're talking about meeting human needs directly, I can give a very concrete example. If I go and grow parsnips in my garden and eat them myself, eat them with my family, or share them with my neighbors, this is kind of the direct meeting of human needs. Whereas if I go and work at Amazon and get a wage and then buy my basic needs through money, this is meeting these needs through what's called exchange value, where in which the idea with capitalist growth is that we produce profits and then we buy our basic needs through our wages. And so this kind of model, what does it really require? Especially if it's going to grow eternally. Or if any of you have ever been in business, you probably understand these two things, but it requires an ever-rising quantity of inputs, but crucially, it requires a cheapening of the price of these inputs. So you'll know if you've kind of been around businesses or heard about the way that businesses function, you know, it's about cheapening the price of the inputs. It's about cheapening the price of labor and buying stuff for as cheap as possible. And this process historically has required an outside or an imperial arrangement. And this is no better exemplified in the way in which colonialism was practiced. The most concrete example, perhaps, is the extraction of silver, of which there was 100,000 tons extracted over the course of the colonial period, and this amounted to a value of around $165 trillion in today's money. The same could be said about cotton, sugar, and this kind of growth model required certain conditions for it to be socially acceptable. In more economic terms, it required enclosure and dispossession. It required the destruction of the commons, taxes in colonial currency, enslavement, and the appropriation of women's labor. So enslavement and appropriation of women's labor is a good example of, you know, how capitalism depresses the price of labor. But also it required some social conditions, such as a dualist ontology. By that, I kind of mean the separation between man and nature, and racist ontology, but also an objectification of women. So this is kind of the kind of raw rump of capitalist relations of production. But in this time, there wasn't really a concept of economic growth as we might know it today. There was a kind of concept of progress, but the term economic growth didn't really exist at this point. You know, you have now it's progress, advancement. So economic growth, where did it really come from? And so Matthias Schmelzer, who wrote this amazing book called The Hegemony of Growth, asked this really pertinent question of how did economic growth come to be universally seen as a self-evident goal of economic policymaking? And how was this constantly reproduced in changing circumstances? So, you know, what he really suggests was that economic growth wasn't really kind of this historically self-evident thing. It actually came about through a specific ensemble of discourses, economic theory, and statistical standards that actually came to dominate under very specific historical and social conditions around the second half of the 20th century. So to go over this quite briefly, so statistical developments actually gave rise to the idea that we can measure the economy as this distinct entity. So with the rise of econometrics, we were actually for the first time supposedly able to measure the economy And this was firstly done through what's called national accounting, but the kind of measurement that was used was what we now know as GDP. And Simon Kuznets in the top right there was the inventor of GDP. And this is basically the kind of GDP is defined as the money that's passed hands in an economy. So everything from you go into the shop to buy something to the money paid to the company that cleans up oil spills, this is all included in GDP. And so around the kind of turn of the around the Second World War, particularly when countries were trying to give out Marshall Plan aid, so the Marshall Plan was this kind of aid set of when they were giving aid after the Second World War. America was giving out aid, and in order to kind of try and identify where aid should be given, they asked for countries to be able to quantify their economies. And so within this context of European reconstruction, economies start to be measured, and particularly in terms of how money passed through hands. Set against the backdrop equally of Cold War competition, GDP was adopted as a measurement of progress. But Simon Kuznets in 1934, as soon as GDP was announced, actually warned against using GDP as a measurement of well-being. So he actually said that GDP is actually a measurement of productive capacity of the economy, not a socio-economic measurement of well-being. And it was only around 1961 when GDP actually got adopted as a official kind of growth target mechanism. This was in relation to kind of Cold War competition. So the Soviet Union started setting growth targets, and it was very specific around this OECD meeting in 1961, where countries are starting to debate whether to set growth targets, and pretty much most of the world was actually against, most of the OECD, the OECD being most of the kind of Western states that we'd associate with the Cold War, so Western Europe, North America, Oceania. So most of the OECD was actually against implementing growth targets, but in 1961, at the advent of a meeting with the OECD, the American delegation leaked to the press that they were going to implement growth targets. So growth targets were adopted, and ever since then, there's been this kind of path dependency of GDP as a metric of well-being. Now, kind of more to the rump and less of the history. So growth really is presented, and is still presented, as this common good. It turns difficult questions around the distribution of wealth and the goals of policymaking into these technical, non-political questions about how to just increase economic output. And it's pursued really as a cure-all for multiple socioeconomic challenges. If we grow, it doesn't really matter how wealth is distributed, because as the famous saying goes, a rising tide lifts all boats. So it's kind of the ideology of Margaret Thatcher, but it was also still pursued today. Because GDP, really, if you increase GDP, it produces progress, well-being, and power. And since it's only measured in numbers, we can really just grow forever, because it's all just numbers, is the assumption. And we see how economic growth really is. We've talked about it a little bit before, but economic growth is so embedded within the way we approach politics. This is a bit of propaganda from the Tories in the 80s. In the top right here is actually the 8th Sustainable Development Goal, which prioritizes economic growth from the United Nations. Keir Starmer is obsessed with growth. Liz Truss, growth, 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 was a bit of a tagline of hers. And then also there's this quite complex diagram about global growth forecasts. So it's very much kind of embedded in the way we think about politics and economics. So yeah, what is wrong with growth though? This is something we've kind of taught that we're taught is good. However, as I said earlier, this is a quote from Simon Kuznets, the inventor of GDP. He said that income statistics measure not socioeconomic welfare, but the productive and consumption capacity of a nation. And this quote from Robert F. Kennedy, who is quite a traditional politician, is one that I really like, and is kind of one of the early critics of GDP in particular. I'll read it out because I think it's quite pertinent. He says, "The gross national product does not allow for the health of our children. quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry, or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. Now, from the degrowth perspective, there are 7 critiques of growth. I'm going to kind of focus on the ecological critique today, and maybe the north-south critique a little bit. But these are the kind of 7 critiques that we give of economic growth. So I want to kind of start with the ecological critique, which for a lot of people is really the most compelling. And it kind of works from this cliche that you can't have infinite economic growth on a finite planet. So if we're assuming that economic growth is tied to the amount of stuff we use, if you have 3%, if you have just 3% growth every year, and so if you only have 3% annual growth, this doubles the rate of economic production every 24 years. So the economy gets twice as large every 24 years. And so if you have this infinite economic growth, then eventually the simple thesis is you're going to run out of stuff. But I'm going to go into a little bit more of the base argument that was given by a guy called Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen in the 70s. And he is the original ecological economist who kind of gave the argument that kind of rests at the base of degrowth thinking today. So his thesis was that he wants to apply the second law of thermodynamics to the economic process. And this sounds a little bit convoluted, but I'll try and spell it out quite quickly and simply. So entropy really is when you have a object that is in a state of high entropy. So picture me with a lump of coal in my hands. When you use it up, it moves from a state of high entropy to a state of low entropy. And it goes from a state of potential to used upness. So that coal can never again, at least in the next 10,000 years or millions of years, it can never become a lump of coal with high energy potential again. So he kind of applies this to the economic process, and in this he identifies certain limits to growth, because when we're looking at this diagram on the right here, we're talking, and this is his famous hourglass diagram, and he looks at the amount of, and this is kind of a representation of energy that flows through our economies. So humanity currently relies on what he termed the terrestrial stock. This is our fossil fuel bounty. This is coal, natural gas, which is stock limited, i.e. there's a limited amount of it. And this is what he said. He said it was flow abundant. So this means we can kind of use it at a very high rate, as we've seen. Because it is so easy to burn and it's so easy to extract coal, oil, and natural gas, we can kind of use this energy very quickly. Whereas solar stock, which is in the top of the hourglass there, is what he terms flow limited. This basically means that it's quite difficult to siphon this energy. We kind of see this from how solar and wind energy is a lot less efficient, but it's stock abundant. Sorry, so there is an unlimited amount of it, but it just takes a lot more time to gather and use. So I want to quickly apply this to 2 ways of thinking about the economy. So this on the left is the kind of typical diagram you get about what an economy looks like in like an economics textbook. We have the consumers on the left, we have the firms and businesses on the right. They're all trading with each other. You get these flows of wages, labor, goods and services. But what it doesn't really do is it doesn't embed the economy in the biosphere. And this is what Georgescu-Roegen tried to do. He tried to basically suggest that the economy is a subsystem of the biosphere. And whilst there might be these economic relations going on within a society, these economies depend on the biosphere for their inputs and for where they put their waste. So on the left here, you can see the raw material inputs are put into the human economy and they're expelled as waste. and some of it is recycled, but anything we use in our economy does go into the Earth system as waste. So this is kind of what you call bioeconomics. And I just want to quickly revisit these two graphs, and particularly the graph on the right, because particularly with environmentalism, a lot of time we focus on carbon emissions as this, this is what it means to be sustainable. Global warming is being caused by carbon emissions, and we need to reduce carbon emissions, and then we'll solve climate change. But the argument is this is what's called carbon tunnel vision, and there are we have to think about materials in particular when we're thinking about what it actually means to embody a sustainable society. So the question is how far are we as a society overshooting our planetary carrying capacity, and who really needs to degrow? So the maximum level of energy use that can be considered sustainable so this is like hitting 1.5 degrees without negative emissions tech. So there needs to be a global reduction of energy use in particular by an order of 3. This is an order of 10 in Australia, order of 6 in the UK, and a material footprint reduction by order of 3 in the UK. On the left, on the right, sorry, you might have seen this diagram from this great organization called the Earth Overshoot Day, and they basically calculate at what point in the year each country in the world overshoots their kind of carrying capacity. So if the whole world, so you see on December the 20th, Jamaica reaches their Earth Overshoot Day. So yeah. Anyway, so quickly, why does growth no longer serve us in a more kind of socio-economic sense? So what seems to happen with growth is that most of it's captured by the wealthy. So from this diagram, we can see that the top 1% capture 38% of the economic output that's produced by growth. This is the same for the top 2%, which capture 50% of the wealth produced by economic growth, at least since 1995. Particularly as well, there's something which is called the Eastland paradox, which basically suggests that beyond a certain point in economic growth, doesn't actually seem to be many improvements in life satisfaction. This is like subjective life satisfaction as gathered through surveys. The Eastland argues that there is a point around $10,000 GDP per capita, where up to this point, life satisfaction does improve. But beyond this point, actually, kind of improvements in GDP don't actually mean that people's lives necessarily get better as they perceive it. There's also this kind of cultural critique of growth. Growth, as we currently know it, relies on positional goods, hedonic treadmills. So what I mean by that, so positional goods is, if someone buys a Ferrari, you want a Ferrari, or at least that's the kind of logic of consumption. The hedonic treadmill is the idea put forward by Kate Sopper. She basically suggests that our kind of method of fulfillment in modern society is we're kind of just looking at ways of satisfying hedonism rather than kind of more fulfillment-based life satisfactions. We're looking for it's a pleasure-based model of satisfaction, and this is kind of this is what's really driving growth. So quickly, before I talk about the degrowth prescription, I want to kind of ask, why not green growth? So green growth is basically the idea that we can increase GDP whilst greening it. So this usually means reducing emissions, but sometimes people also talk about reducing material throughput whilst also increasing GDP. So this scenario would be called decoupling. So if you increase GDP whilst decreasing emissions, this will be called decoupling. And there is some research that 18 countries have decoupled emissions, and they've decoupled GDP from greenhouse gas emissions by a median of 2.5%. But this is quite difficult because growing an economy like this makes it more difficult to hit urgent climate targets. So Jason Nichols says this is like running up a downwards accelerating escalator. Hold on, let me just grab my notes real quick. Yeah, so if you want to kind of reduce greenhouse gas emissions while still growing an economy, this makes it infinitely more difficult. So another argument against green growth is this thing called the Jevons's paradox. So this is the idea, it was introduced by an economist in 1865, who, when he was looking at coal production in the UK, he basically noticed that despite the fact that coal production was increasing, people were just using, despite the fact that the efficiency of coal use was increasing, people were just using more coal. So this is the idea that as energy use in particular gets more efficient, there seems to be actually a net increase in the amount of energy that is used, because there's this impression that we can use more because it's more efficient. The green growth narrative also relies on technological optimism. This is the idea that technology is going to come save us. The most stark example of this is negative emissions technology. This is like carbon capture and storage. This is like the kind of prime example of this. This idea that we can suck carbon out of the atmosphere, and that means we can keep producing greenhouse gases. And yeah, there's a whole collection of problems around negative emissions technology, which I won't really go into right now. But finally, economic growth relies on what's called green imperialism. You might have heard of it, but so basically relies on commodity frontiers. These are mostly located in the global south, and these supply the cheap inputs that kind of fuel economic growth. So the kind of base thesis is this: the lifestyles of the few in the West come at the expense of those whose labor and resources are exploited in the global south. So the circle to be squared really is, how do we downscale production and consumption in line with planetary boundaries whilst improving human and non-human well-being? And this is where I'll talk about the degrowth alternative. So how do we build a new paradigm? So this really emerged as degrowth emerged as a concept following the Club of Rome's report entitled The Limits to Growth in the 1970s. The term itself was first coined by André Gorz in 1972, and it began emerging as a social movement and a research agenda in the 1990s, particularly out of the car-free cities movement in France during the 1990s. If you can see in the background of this slide, there's a very blurry picture of my friend Francois Schneider, who was a big part of the car-free cities movement in France in the 90s. And he was one of the first people to kind of inject degrowth as a term into social movements in environmental circles. So degrowth really is both a diagnosis of the problems with economic growth, but also a prognosis of societal transformation. And it really asks, if we want to thrive within planetary boundaries, how must we organize societies? So quickly about the name. So it's disruptive, it's provocative, and supposedly a missile word in that it's trying to disrupt the status quo. It's this deliberate kind of altercation with growth, something that is kind of pretty much universally accepted as a good thing in society. We think it's useful because it's honest, and particularly it can't be co-opted. So here I'm thinking about terms and kind of alternative economic paradigms that have been co-opted. So I'm thinking about things like the well-being economy, sustainable development. These are things that kind of have a bit of give in them and can be easily co-opted into kind of capitalist logics. So if people think growth is good, and by extension degrowth is bad, then people don't understand how harmful further economic growth really is. So George Callis represents this really nicely. He says, as opposed to being agnostic, degrowth is atheist. It understands that the religion of capitalist growth won't go away without a fight and by ignoring it. So what's the actual kind of prescription of degrowth? You know, how do we actually build an economy that doesn't rely on economic growth, and whilst downscaling production and consumption also improves well-being and reorients societal objectives towards care, well-being, autonomy, and ecological integrity? And the base idea really is to actively decouple well-being from growth. So how do we kind of provision our basic needs without growth, which is what we're told is what we need for our basic needs to be satisfied? So I've kind of given two sides here. We have state-based provisioning and non-state. So there's 1,000 policies in the degrowth literature, but they're kind of drawing from things that already exist. So potential universal basic services, state-funded job guarantees, maximum income caps, nationalisation and reappropriation of key industries from the state perspective, or non-state policies such as reclaiming the commons, food sovereignty, energy democracy, or cooperatives, housing co-ops and co-living, and not-for-profit co-ops. So this here is a great iceberg diagram of degrowth adjacent policies produced by Fitzpatrick and Timothy Parikh. So on the top, it kind of gives the ones that are pretty much universally prescribed in the degrowth literature, and then the ones kind of below the surface are ones that haven't reached a kind of degree of consensus in the literature, but also are absolutely discussed as useful policies transformation. Yeah, so going back to the definition here. So when we're thinking about a just downscaling of production and consumption, degrowth really targets these areas of production that are socially useless, but environmentally destructive. So things like planned obsolescence, SUVs, militaries, fast fashion, luxury goods, aviation, single-use products, large homes, unsustainable meat. And when we're thinking about building a society that integrates care, well-being, autonomy, and ecological integrity, we're thinking about policies such as universal basic services or income, job guarantees, commons, work time reduction, agroecological food provisioning, time banking, public transport and cycling, etc. So these are kind of the more policy-based objectives, but really degrowth surely requires a shift in culture, and this is why Demaria and Latouche's definition kind of gets at this more cultural transition a little bit better. It says a decolonization of the imaginary and implementation of other worlds is necessary for a degrowth transition. So the decolonization of the imaginary is really removing economic growth as this kind of objective of society, and this really means that degrowth needs to be a set of ethical principles, not just a set of policies. So we're thinking about sufficiency. Oh, sorry, I was just looking at the chat very quickly. Okay. So a couple of examples of this are sufficiency / simplicity. I think sufficiency is a really important one because sufficiency indicates that we need to think about what is enough in societies. How are we going to set limits on consumption, whilst also kind of living good lives. Radical abundance, proposed by Jason Hickel. So this is kind of getting at the difference between private and public abundance. So private abundance is, us all living our own private lives. I have a banquet every night with my family, and I have a massive swimming pool in my house, and I'm able to fly my own private jet. This is what we mean by private abundance, whereas public abundance, I think, is really well represented by these two examples in the pictures at the bottom. So this is the idea that we can have abundance in a way that is shared. We can have access to the means by which we can pursue good lives, but they're shared in common. And I think, to be honest, the Lido is the most fantastic representation of what it means to have access to leisure, but it be shared in common. The same with community gardens. And finally, maybe conviviality as a process of being together and producing together, rather than just kind of individualizing our incomes, marching off to work and gathering our own wages and buying our basic needs with our individual wages. So I'm not sure how I've been speaking for a while, but I'm just going to quickly go through a couple of examples of specific sectors and how degrowth might be applied to these sectors. So we can start with transport. So urban transport infrastructure really kind of kneels at the altar of the car, and really redistributing space away from private cars and towards pedestrians, bicycles, trams, buses, and light rails is at the heart of this kind of urban degrowth transition. The kind of main point here is that these options crucially don't reduce people's mobility and their ability to move around the city. Rather, they're usually quicker, quieter, safer, and less polluting. And this makes them universally accessible. public transport really needs to be decommodified and free at the point of use. This all involves planning for the bicycle. And yeah, we can talk about what about the countryside. So there's kind of this clear tension when we're thinking about rural degrowth, given these areas' car dependencies. So the answer is kind of a mixture of these previously mentioned strategies: car sharing in villages, reliable free public transport. Yes, that's even if it's unprofitable, and reigniting rural public services. But I think a really good representation of how we can actually reduce production and consumption whilst actually keeping people's levels of well-being the same or improving them is if you have a car share between 10 people and you're kind of using the car sparingly, this actually doesn't really particularly in urban areas, it doesn't actually reduce people's ability to satisfy their basic needs. It just means that we use 10 times less resources in producing cars while still maintaining access to transport. I won't talk about holidays now, and I won't talk about degrowth and energy. I'll maybe quickly talk about this example of what Georgios Kallas calls real existing degrowth in Ikaria in Greece. It's a small island in the Mediterranean, has a very long radical history. During the Greek Civil War, there was a lot of communists were exiled to Ikaria, 13,000 communists. And basically, these two Greek academics, they went to Ikaria and they both specialized in degrowth. And when they were talking about degrowth for the locals, they were kind of rebuffed by someone in the audience who said, you know, we've lived this way long before you invented degrowth. And this is because Ikaria's economy and social life can be described as kind of communalist, as a low intensity economy, much of it operating outside formal markets. It's distributed sport sufficiency rather than accumulation. And this communist ethos was really birthed for several reasons. It's kind of remoteness, it's harshness, but also this kind of history of radical politics. But really what I want to get across is these values of temperance, conviviality, and slowness really typify how we envision a degrowth society. And this is what is really represented and practiced in Ikaria. A lot of them cite anti-capitalism as a central aspect of their politics. But what might come across from this is, you know, it's quite a boring place to live, you know, very slow, but that doesn't mean there's no outpourings of joy. On the right is the summer harvest festival, where they all come together to perform actually one of the most beautiful folk dances I've ever seen, which is the Ikariotikos. And yeah, I could go on about it, but yeah, I will kind of finish up a little bit by talking about how we can organize for degrowth and how it actually fits into thinking about socio-ecological change, and how as activists we think about degrowth, because it did kind of emerge as a research agenda and has been accused in the past of being quite academic and not really kind of applicable to real world change because it's quite complex. But you know, the seeds of socio-economic transformation are visible, and it really might seem daunting to move towards this new world. But we kind of identify 3 different levels of strategy for thinking about how we can transform society, particularly when we're thinking about organizing towards the ideals that degrowth proposes. And these 3 levels of strategy are coined from this guy called Eric Olin Wright. And he starts with what's called symbiotic strategies, which is basically the idea that you can use the beast to tame it. This is usually associated with using the state to try and generate change. So quickly to say, as Degrowth London, we really believe in kind of a diversity of strategies. We're not necessarily anarchists. We don't believe in completely rejecting the state. We are not necessarily state socialist either. We think kind of using a diverse set of strategies, and that's including direct action as well. We think all of these levels of strategies are useful, and we don't think they're opposed. So a lot of policies advocated for by degrowthers need the state to put them in place. You know, stuff like job guarantees, maximum income caps, better recycling schemes, public transport, these all require the state. Whereas if we think about interstitial strategies, this is kind of working within the cracks of the old. So this is not waiting for the state to produce the change we need. This is actually prefiguring it and building it into existence in the here and now. So I'm thinking about, you know, housing cooperatives, and thinking about community gardens, and thinking about these kind of initiatives which are more grassroots. And finally, ruptural strategies. I'm talking here about direct action. This is actually trying to stop the capitalist-based growth system in its tracks and disrupting it in the here and now. But the kind of critique of this strategy is that it doesn't really think about how we can actually build a new society. This is kind of my critique of Just Stop Oil, for example. You know, they're very much focused on opposing something which is absolutely what we need, but also if they are the main environmental actor and they aren't proposing an alternative paradigm, then it kind of it just seems like the environmentalist is uniquely standing against rather than building. Right, I'll really quickly talk about Degrowth London. But so, as I said, we're kind of a young fledgling organization. We got set up because we wanted to emulate some of the degrowth groups that were existing around Europe, particularly Degrowth Vienna, who are doing amazing work in municipal politics, but also in community outreach and just doing political education around degrowth and spreading and proliferating these ideas. So we have a sociocratic governance structure, which is in the bottom right. Sociocracy is basically this kind of horizontal democratic structure where there's zero hierarchy within the organization. We have 3 different working groups, one focused on community outreach, one focused on political engagement, one on digital communications, and yeah, these feed back into a general circle. And yeah, I can talk a little bit about more about those if you like, but I'll actually probably stop there. And I was waiting for ages, I'm sorry. And we can do a quick Q&A, but I know it was meant to finish at 8, so I'm sorry about that.
Absolutely amazing, Jack. That's a real education. We can usually flow on 5-10 minutes or more as people want to stay or if they need to beam off. But thank you very much. That was really educational. A lot of learnings. So without too much further ado, if people want to ask a question, down the bottom there is this reactions thing, and you can a little button down the bottom, reactions. You can raise or lower a hand. If anyone on the University Challenge panel out there would like to ask Jack a question about that, please raise your hand. You can physically raise a hand as well, but it's easier if you use that button, or you could put it in the chat. So anyone out there on the coming back there on Lisa, claps from Lisa. So yeah, stick your hands up if you've got a question. I'd just like to say, I think, you know, it's really amazing the work that's been done there. They talk about the implementation of other worlds. There's an old saying from some of our movements about another world is possible. And the other part of that phrase is, in many places, it's already here. And bits, particularly at the end where you're talking about the island, there's many places that I visited, communities and projects that are working on many of these things you talk about and the degrowth strategies, but you know, they're not as well known or talked about or networked, and we need to link up these islands of new possibilities, really. So it's great work you're doing. That's absolutely fantastic. If people want to find out more, they can get in touch. Any questions or feedback? Doesn't have to be a question. You can make a comment or feedback. Lisa, hand up, old style.
Yeah, unmute. I know. Well, I did anyway. No. Yeah. So Jack, thank you. I've become interested in degrowth. I started by reading Jason Hickel and Less is More, and now I run a little community garden and anyway, I'd like to try and spread the word. I'm just become involved with the local Green Party on their policy group, and I just wondered whether this organisation you have been able to or planning to try and speak with organisations like the Green Party, and sort of, I mean, you know, there are elements within their, you know, policies and manifestos around degrowth, but there's a lot that isn't degrowth in there as well. So I don't know if that's something you have done or would do, and potentially, would you possibly give a talk to Colchester Green Party? Sorry, that's 3 things. Right.
Yeah, so that is already happening. So one of our members in particular is quite a prominent member of the Islington Green Party, and so yeah, as you say, there is kind of a lot of stuff in the Green Party manifesto or kind of Green Party policy platform that is semi-critical of economic growth and is more trying to focus on well-being as an objective in economy rather than just simply economic growth. Caroline Lucas has come out in favour of criticising economic growth. She's not explicitly called for degrowth, but there's a lot of kind of sympathy within the Degrowth Party, only in the Green Party, for kind of not focusing on economic growth as an explicit policy objective. But yeah, what it really raises the question for me is whether we need to have degrowth adopted as a ideal by parties, or whether you can kind of sneak degrowth in the back door, because there's kind of a lot of debate about whether it matters if degrowth is kind of adopted explicitly or whether it just happens by proxy, because if we have a lot of policies that are part of like kind of a degrowth policy package being introduced, then it might just happen anyway without even having to name it as degrowth. But I think but yeah, I think our member Sheridan, she's had a lot of success in talking to the Islington Green Party, and I mean they're a particularly kind of bold Green Party cadre from what I understand. So yeah, I think that there is kind of room for thinking about this in party politics. I think the Green Party is an excellent vehicle for it, because I love the idea of like Transform UK and these new parties emerging, but I think the Green Party for now is probably the most useful vehicle for thinking about integrating degrowth into kind of electoral politics.
Okay, lovely. And Jack, I know you're giving a talk tonight, but I'm not sure I would feel particularly confident in giving a talk about it. But I wondered whether it would be something that you or a member of your group might consider doing, if it would be over Zoom. Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, great.
Okay, I mean, so, it really is a question of, we talk about system change a lot, but I suppose this and the talk tonight really, and Jack's gone into it in a lot more detail about how do we change the system really, and it's a banner that we painted for many years and a slogan that gets pushed around, but I'm really glad to see that people are actually working into this. And what does system change look like? We can't have infinite growth on a finite planet, so what does this degrowth future, or a future beyond capitalism, a sustainable future look like? We have to start redesigning our economic, our political, our environmental systems. I think someone had a question there. So Jane saying she has to go, but Sarah was asking, can they share the slides? I think.
Yes, please.
If you could share the slides at some point, Jack, or communicate to each other and share. Jack, there's a Degrowth London, is there an email or something people can contact you? And I think Eleanor's got a contact. We'll probably wrap up soon, guys, in about 5 minutes or so. If people do need to beam out, you can beam out. Eleanor?
Hi there, hello Jack. Great, thank you, that was amazing. I'm so glad that there's a degrowth group in London. I'm interested in UBI, in the UBI Lab Network. I just wanted to ask about categorizing growth. So obviously there are different types of growth, and not all of them are industrial or service-based, but I just wondered what you think about this. All the things that we want to see and all the wonderful things that are already happening, if there were scaled up and more happened, surely they would create social value and hopefully even prosperity. So wouldn't that still be growth? So what is it that we want to get away from? Obviously the material output and energetic output, but all the things that we're doing, wouldn't that still, all the things that we want to do, wouldn't that still constitute growth, and it would show itself in GDP? Does that make sense of your question?
It does. I've just muted you, Elena. But yeah, so you're completely right. I think we need to be selective about how we talk about growth. So when we're talking about degrowth, it pretty much exclusively is talking about material, so the amount of stuff that's flowing through the economy. This is what needs to be degrown. But you're right. So there is kind of this downscaling of socially useless and ecologically destructive areas of production. But also, you know, it's very obvious that we need to grow certain areas of production and consumption. So I'm talking about like public services. You know, obviously, healthcare needs to grow positively in its quality rather than necessarily its. I would be hesitant to say size, but the kind of amount of stuff that it uses. So, for example, I saw an amazing report the other day that you know, Spain, actually, no, I'm not going to spout this here, but basically Spain has one of the highest quality provisioning of healthcare. The amount of resources it actually uses is something like 4 times less per capita than America, even though, and its quality is far superior, even though it uses less stuff. But yeah, so we need to be, we're talking about degrowing some things, but growing some things sustainably. So I'm talking about growing public services and degrowing less necessary production. Yeah, hope that makes sense.
So is there a language for that then, so that we can make it clear that there are good areas of growth? Is there a language for that?
There is, and someone did give me a very nice way of phrasing that the other day, which I have forgotten. But there is kind of a nice, sexy activist term that we can use. Which I have forgotten that little
evolving language.
Language.
But sometimes we need the words to describe these better futures we want to see. I think Helen has got a very good question in the chat, but let's get her to ask it there. Helen.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you know, if all the main parties are funded by capitalists and they're fighting hard to retain their profits, which is why we're seeing lots of strikes and stuff like that. So how do we get them to give up control so that we're not overproducing? Because that's what's happening. There's a lot of overproduction going on. So how do you get them to give up control? Obviously, because they've got control of the media as well. I know there's a lot of good pockets of stuff going on, but how do you have to have a vehicle for that to be taken forward that'll link everyone up? So.
Yeah, I hear you, Helen. And I guess this kind of depends on your theory of change, right? Some people think that the state is so captured by capitalist interests that it's completely impossible for us to think about even using the state or reappropriating businesses like fossil fuel companies or big agri-food companies for our interests. We think they're too large and too captured by certain interests that, you know, we can't even rely on them at all. We can't convince them to provision sustainably. We can't convince them to be ethical, so there's no point in even engaging with them. It kind of depends on how you envision social change. Like for me, I really don't believe that we can do that. I think actually kind of building resilient local economies is a much more kind of viable strategy for thinking about social change. So kind of exemplifies this a little bit in thinking about you know, building from the bottom up, thinking about provisioning housing locally into a form of housing cooperatives, you know, provisioning food locally to the best extent we can, provisioning energy locally, and through doing this we kind of reduce our dependence on these companies, these states that are effectively parasites. But then, you know, this would obviously be made a lot easier if there was a state that was more of an enabling state. You'd maybe assume that if there was this groundswell of grassroots democracy and grassroots basic provisioning, that there would also be a kind of shift within kind of electoral culture. So you'd hopefully have a party kind of gaining control of the state, which is a little bit more conducive to kind of a process of autonomization where people are kind of producing their own well-being. But yeah, it really depends on how you view change and where you think people's efforts are best directed. For me, it's like in our communities. For some people, it might be winning elections.
I think that's very good. I think we have to give the final question to Julian there. We're about 10 past, we're usually on the hour and stuff. Absolutely, really inspiring, lots of thought-provoking stuff tonight. And one of the reasons why we need climate emergency centres is to build these local community resilient networks and projects to share more and consume less, I think would be one of the other phrases. I think over to Julian, who's got a question.
Yeah, really good. And unfortunately, I haven't really got enough background on it to be able to ask a sensible question. But what I was going to ask is, I noticed you're studying Tim Jackson's books in Degrowth London, for example. Is there any, what would you recommend as the best way to sort of learn a bit more about this?
There's a lot. So the best introductory book I could recommend is, I'll type in the chat, it's like 80 pages, it's amazing. It's called The Case for Degrowth, it's by 4 authors. One being, I'll just type the first author in. So this was made for activists, really. It's made for it's non-academic. It's got like FAQs at the end of the book for kind of typical rebuttals. And yeah, this is probably the best place to get started. There's lots of good stuff on YouTube. If you're kind of looking to dig a little deeper, there's a book called The Future is Degrowth, which is, I'll just quickly type it out. And then there's also one final thing I'll mention is there's this YouTube channel called Degrowth Talks, which is made during the pandemic, which is really good. Lots of great speakers. Yeah, if there's so much out there. We've got some stuff on our website as well, degrowthlondon.org, which kind of gives a little bit of it has a resource list. And if you want this more kind of anti-colonial perspective, Less is More by Jason Hickel is yeah.
Okay, I'm just putting the welcome pack into the chat so that somebody asked about where it will be recorded. There is a YouTube listed in there if you have a look at that. And basically just do YouTube, it's probably easier. And you can have a look at that. Thank you very much to Jack. Absolutely incredible. It's the kind of conversations that we need to be having, basically, on what kind of futures we want to see and how do we redesign the system. So the YouTube going up just there now in the chat. Thank you very much for your time, Jack. Any parting comments before we beam out?
No, just want to say how much I appreciate all the work you guys are doing. Very inspired by climate emergency centres, and wish there was one near me.
Where are you, Jack?
I am in Walthamstow.
There is a beginning of a Walthamstow group. There's a big cinema that's empty in Walthamstow that should be used for community stuff. I think it was something went on a little while ago. So thank you very much, everyone. Save the chat if you want the details here. We've gone on a little longer tonight, but very interesting discussion. So thank you very much to everyone. And next Wednesday, we have Che from Crops Not Shops. They're a fantastic group that are basically getting bits of land being given to them all over the UK, and they are getting people to grow their own food collectively in groups so that they get crops rather than shops. And that's 15th, next Wednesday 15th. On the Wednesday the 22nd, the following week, an old friend Clemmy James is coming to talk about an amazing new report she's done at a UN level, all about changing drug policy, because our current drug policy is destroying the Amazon rainforest. It's not the Brazilian government that really controls the front end of what's being destroyed in the Amazon. It is actually the drug cartels. And she's saying we need to change the drug policy in order to shift some of that. And she's coming on possibly, I think, with an ex-undercover police officer who's going to say why he thinks the war on drugs isn't such a clever idea. That will be very interesting indeed. And the last one of November, the 29th, is Jules from Community Climate Action, who are helping groups all across the UK write community climate action plans in their areas. and making a lot of progress there. So it's the same web link every single week, and same passcodes generally. So look forward to seeing you next week. Check out the website and the welcome pack. I'll post the rest of it in the chat in a minute. Thank you very much for coming. Give us an hour of your precious time. Big up yourselves. Network and organise wherever you are, and let's get degrowthing and sharing more and consuming less, and set up a centre where you can share your things. Take care. If you want to say a few words as parting, say goodbye. Anything you want to bang out at the end? Over.
Bye. Great. Yeah.
All right. Nice one, guys. Okay. Save the chat. Save the chat. Stop recording. Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Jack. Amazing.
Thanks, Felix. Appreciate it.
Brilliant.